So you want to eat the best foods to support good brain health, whether that's good memory, good focus, whether that's good mental health, whether that's preventing dementia, whether that's just generally thinking and feeling better. We do know that our diet has a lot to say as it relates to what happens within our brains. So what are the foods that we should be thinking about as the top of the list for brain health? I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and in this video, we're going to be talking about some of the research connecting specific foods with better brain health outcomes. And we'll be diving into some of the mechanisms that connect certain foods with better brain health. If you're new here, I am an internal medicine doctor, but I've spent the majority of the last decade educating people on the tools and tactics they can use to enhance brain health now and prevent brain issues later using lifestyle modifications. And if that is interesting to you, please be sure to subscribe, and that'll let me know that you're interested in brain health, and it'll help me to create even better content for you. Quick disclaimer here, this is educational content only. It is not intended to take the place of you and your healthcare practitioner's relationship. And if you are thinking about making any changes to your healthcare routine, you should really run those by your healthcare practitioner. Okay, let's talk about this subject, food and brain health. Again, we're going to be going into some of the research connecting some of the best studied foods for better brain health. And we're going to talk about some of the foods that I absolutely have in my kitchen at all times, and some of the foods that you might consider adding into your diet to help decrease your risk of developing brain issues and improving your brain function today. As quick background here, it's really important to understand that for the average person today, the food that they are eating is actually quite unhealthy for their overall well-being and especially for their brains. Unlike some of the people that may have said that the brain and body are separate, we know that what happens in the body influences the brain, and this is definitely the case for the nutrients we consume in our food. If we are consuming quality nutrients from our food, it does have an impact on both the physical makeup and the functional capabilities of our brains. So thinking about that, and we consider again what most people are eating a heavily refined, ultra-processed diet. And that definitely correlates with worse brain health. We know that people who eat a more ultra-processed diet are at a higher risk for developing mental health conditions like depression and are at a higher risk for developing conditions like dementia. So inversely, we see that people who eat a diet that is made of minimally processed foods tend to have better brain health, better mental health, better cognitive health, better focus and attention. And I would be remiss if I did not say that the best research we have is not in eating a specific superfood for brain health, but rather in eating a sustainable pattern of minimally processed foods for many years. And the best studied diet, you probably heard me say this before, for brain health is something like the Mediterranean pattern diet, a diet that emphasizes a diversity of minimally processed foods that includes a majority of plant foods as well as fish. We'll be talking about that in this video. Healthy fats, which has been kind of taboo in the nutrition world as it relates to health, as well as spices, colorful fruits and vegetables. And depending on which version of the Mediterranean diet you look at, it also includes carbohydrates, especially in the form of whole grains. Okay, so with all this in mind, let's now get into some of the key foods that have been studied to correlate with better brain function. I'll be giving you some examples of where you can find them, the amount of these foods that you might consider consuming, and some of my favorite tools and how I incorporate these into my diet. So the first superfood, and we'll use that term a little bit loosely here, but the first amazing food for the brain based on the available research from both a mechanistic perspective and from epidemiological data suggesting that people consuming this food do better relating to their brain health is going to be fatty fish. That, when we talk about fish, is not necessarily a comment on their weight. It is a comment on the fact that they are high in fats, in lipids. And as a moment of background here, you've probably heard this before, but it has been the case in nutrition science for some time that there has been a kind of bias against consumption of fat and cholesterol, but fat in particular in the context of a concern that eating more fat is going to be bad for our bodies and bad for our brains. And this is predicated on research specifically in saturated fat consumption, where there was concern that saturated fat was linked to cardiovascular health issues, and that was kind of extrapolated to a bunch of other conditions. We now understand that the nuance is important and that consumption of fat is not necessarily bad for us, especially when we look at specific types of fat. This is absolutely the case as we look at fatty fish. So why are fatty fish such a great choice when it comes to brain health? Well, fatty fish are particularly rich in a polyunsaturated fatty acid called omega-3. There are multiple types of omega-3 fatty acids in our diet, but the most important of the omega-3s, as it's been studied for brain health, are EPA and DHA. Fatty fish tend to be particularly rich in these EPA and DHA molecules. And importantly, while your body is able to create some level of EPA and DHA from precursor molecules that you can get from plant-based foods, the conversion rate is not good enough to get most people to the levels of EPA and DHA that have been studied for optimal brain function. EPA and DHA have different but also overlapping roles in brain health. They play key roles in regulating the brain's immune system. They're involved in neuronal protection because they're involved in the cell membrane of our neurons. And by and large, what we've seen is that people who get adequate amounts of EPA and DHA, these key omega-3s from their diet, tend to have better brain health. Omega-3 fatty acids, again, the DHA and EPA that are found in these fatty fish are linked to, just to give you a sense as to the outcomes, improved cognition, improved memory, a decreased risk of neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's, as well as better mood. And just generally speaking, these are molecules that support a host of processes in the brain. When we look at relationships between consumption of fatty fish and overall brain health, the research supports that people who eat more servings of these fatty fish, and we'll talk about some specific fish in a moment, tend to have a improvement in overall brain health and a decreased chance of developing age-related cognitive decline, which is incredibly important. Now, as one correlate to this, if we were going to say, well, if these nutrients are important, these fatty acids are important, should we just take them in supplement form? And what I would say is when we get to the conversation around supplements, it becomes a little bit more nuanced. There is a wide range of quality of supplements, both in terms of what is in them and in terms of how those ingredients have been processed. So sticking here to just the food part of the conversation, the research shows us that eating about 2 servings of fatty fish per week seems to be best as it relates to maintaining a baseline of omega-3 consumption, these EPA and DHA molecules in particular, to support good brain health. So what are some examples of the fatty fish that you might consider consuming if your goal was to get some of these nutrients in your diet and to support your brain? Well, you want to think here about both the amount of these healthy omega-3s in the fish, and you want to think about potential risk of exposure to toxins that can be found in fish. These are heavy metals. In particular, mercury is a consideration. So while certain fish may have high levels of omega-3s, they can also have high levels of mercury. This becomes especially an issue in long-lived giant fish. So sharks and swordfish can still have omega-3s, but they're also very high in mercury. So some of the fish to consider here would be salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, and herring. And so you can remember the SMASH acronym, SMASH, as a way to remember these fish. But these are going to be a little different for each person, depending on which types of fish they enjoy. Some people don't like small fish like herring or mackerel or anchovies. Some people don't like larger fatty fish like salmon. What I would say for me is that I'm looking for a cost-effective way to get these fish into my diet in a way that also tastes good. And so you can get these things in bulk. One of my favorite ways to do this is to buy sockeye salmon, which comes from Alaska. And important to note that there are differences in the omega content of farmed fish versus wild fish. But maybe even more important is to think about the sustainability aspect of this, something that I do think about. So sockeye salmon from Alaska tend to be sustainably harvested. They're also rich in omega-3s and they're reasonably priced. You can buy sockeye salmon in bulk, frozen, so you have a bunch in stock and it'll last you a while. So that is fatty fish. Again, definitely top of the list as it relates to studied food interventions for good brain health. The second thing on the list of top foods for the brain is going to be nuts. And certainly there's a diversity of types of nuts out there, but we're going to talk about a couple in particular, and then I'll tell you my favorite nut as it relates to improving brain health, which is based in the research. So why are nuts such a brain superfood? Well, they have so many nutrients in them that are linked to good brain health, both in terms of structure and function. So like salmon, they're rich in healthy fats. They do have some of those omega-3 fats, but the key here is that these nuts are full of unsaturated fats that can be helpful to our overall physiology and that may support good brain health. Beyond the fats, however, nuts are rich in polyphenols. And polyphenols are usually thought of as antioxidants. They're a type of phytochemical, which is a non-micronutrient, non-macronutrient found in plants. They also do have magnesium and a host of other vitamins and minerals. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but they are in essence packed with brain boosting nutrients. And I think, again, we get to this conversation about, well, aren't they full of fat? And that's not necessarily a big issue because what we see is with consumption of certain nuts, actually improvements in things like metabolic function, which is actually the opposite of what you would anticipate if it was simply that eating fat was bad for us, was increasing weight. We also see similar outcomes as it relates to cardiovascular disease, showing that people who eat more nuts tend actually to have better cardiovascular function. Again, opposite what we maybe initially thought as it relates to fat consumption, because nuts do have a good amount of fat in addition to protein and these health outcomes. So as I said before, nuts are rich in a variety of nutrients. I think magnesium is especially worthy of consideration. Magnesium is a key nutrient that is involved in neurotransmitter function. It helps us to enhance the quality of our sleep. It's linked to better mental well-being, and it supports neurotransmitter function. So there are many things there to consider as it relates to magnesium being in nuts and that it may be beneficial for us as a source of this magnesium. But there are many other minerals found within nuts that are also super valuable. As it relates to magnesium, almonds and cashews are, I think, at the top of the list, specific to nuts content of magnesium. But beyond this, consumption generally of nuts is linked to better memory, better mood, lower risk of neurodegenerative diseases. And as I said here, as we're picking a maybe top of the list, healthiest nut for the brain, walnuts tend to be, shown in the research, the most beneficial for brain health. And it's interesting because walnuts look kind of like a brain if you ever take a close look at them. So this is one of the reasons that I do keep walnuts in my fridge and try to opt for them when I can. I personally find that almonds taste a little bit better than walnuts. Also, buying walnut butter is really expensive, but when I can get walnuts, definitely at the top of the list. Other nuts to consider, and it's nice sometimes to mix this up. You can get walnuts, as I said, almonds, hazelnuts, pistachios. Cashews are also another interesting example. There's, as I said before, some research suggesting that they're especially high in magnesium. Okay, let's go to food number 3 to support good brain function. This one is blueberries. You've probably heard people before talk about blueberries as a superfood. The reason for this is because they're especially rich in these, again, polyphenols, and in particular flavonoids, which is a subtype of polyphenols. Polyphenols are interesting, as I said, because of the antioxidant capabilities, but we're now understanding that they have effects on the immune system and even things like epigenetic function, which is that they can change the way our DNA is being used. People who eat blueberries regularly tend to have better memory, sharper cognition, and overall better brain resilience. And a study that was published in 2019, they looked at the brain effects of consuming blueberries and found that consumption of blueberries was linked to improvements in delayed memory and executive function in children. And in adults, they found better executive function and better psychomotor function. This is really interesting because executive function in particular is a reflection of the well-being of a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, located right behind the forehead. And executive function is kind of the cornerstone of our ability to make healthy decisions. So if blueberries act on pathways related to the prefrontal cortex and executive function, that is an amazing bit of detail. In a study that was looking on the brain benefits of flavonoids, including those found in blueberries, they found that the translation dose here was something like 15 blueberries a day. That isn't to say that you need to eat exactly 15 blueberries a day. I personally eat a good amount more than that when I have access to them. So it's more just understanding that blueberries are packed with these polyphenol nutrients. Those are linked to better brain function. And in addition, they have fiber and other nutrients that can help support a good brain. If you're purchasing blueberries and trying to incorporate them into your diet, some considerations would be, if you can, to go for organic, and also to consider, just like the salmon or the fish, to purchase frozen, because then you get cost savings and then you can store these for longer. So again, blueberries, amazing food to support brain health. Look for purchasing in bulk. You consider freezing them, either when you can get access to them fresh, or purchasing them frozen in order to get some of the economies of scale from purchasing in bulk. Okay, the next superfood or amazing brain boosting food that we're going to talk about is one of my absolute personal favorites and something that I definitely consume every day and honestly travel with, especially on road trips, because it is that important and tastes that good. So this food is extra virgin olive oil. Extra virgin olive oil, I've talked about at length before. You can see my other content on this subject. It is packed with monounsaturated fats. It's packed with these polyphenol antioxidants. It also has a number of other compounds in it that are linked to better health. For example, it has polyphenols that have been studied to have effects on the neuroimmune system. Extra virgin olive oil has been linked to better brain function and lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. And in a recent study that I've talked about a good amount, consumption of extra virgin olive oil has actually been linked to improvements in blood-brain barrier function, which is really, really interesting in the context of the understanding that if our blood-brain barrier becomes defective, it may facilitate the influx of immune cells from the outside of the body or outside of the brain into the brain, and that can actually lead to brain inflammation and may increase our chances of developing brain issues. So the idea that olive oil can act on the blood-brain barrier is amazing news. As we're looking at how much olive oil and what type of olive oil, what I would say is you do want to shoot for extra virgin olive oil. There is a big difference between more processed forms of olive oil and extra virgin olive oil in terms of the nutrients found in those bottles. You want to consider purchasing it in a dark bottle because olive oil compounds and fats can be sensitive to sunlight. So always look for, when possible, a dark bottle. You also want to consider, you want to consume that olive oil within 3 to 4 months of opening the bottle to maximize the potential health benefits of the compounds you're consuming within that bottle. There's some additional consideration around sourcing. Unfortunately, about 40 to 50% of olive oil that you can find in the United States has been cut with things that are cheaper included in that olive oil. So when possible, you do want to do an investigation into the sourcing of that olive oil and making sure that it is not a blend, that it is actually extra virgin olive oil. We're going to do 2 more of these foods of my top favorite foods for brain health. I would be interested, though, if you're listening to this somewhere, that you're able to comment. What are some of the foods that you've heard of, in addition to what I've already described, that you have heard about as good for the brain? Okay, let's move on to a food that is not often thought about for brain health, but actually should be at the top of all of our lists, and this is spices and herbs. So what's really interesting about these foods is that they are some of the most concentrated sources of polyphenol antioxidants in our diet. And as a couple of examples here, many people are aware of turmeric, how it contains curcumin, and this has been known to have a number of potential effects on things like the immune system. Interestingly, curcumin has been shown to boost levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. That is a protein that is linked to improved memory, to better mood, and to potential reduction in the rate of neurodegenerative diseases. As another example, cinnamon has been shown to improve cognitive function. We also know that saffron, which contains a number of interesting compounds, is linked to better mood and better cognitive function, as well as to decreased symptoms of depression, which I guess falls in the mood bucket. Point here being not that you have to eat a certain amount of cinnamon each day, but that if you incorporate a wide variety of spices and herbs in your diet, you're actually giving your brain a powerful boost of some of these nutrients that have been linked to better brain function. So find what you actually enjoy and incorporate them into your cooking. The final food we're going to talk about here, which I think goes well at the end because it's kind of thought of as a dessert style food, is dark chocolate. Now, I want to begin this part of the conversation with the understanding that the majority of chocolate products on the market are not very good for you. They are packed with a ton of extra ingredients, in particular added sugar. Added sugar is kind of the antithesis of what we're talking about here as it relates to better brain health. So buying a chocolate bar at the gas station that has a little bit of chocolate and a whole lot of sugar and a bunch of other additives is not what we're talking about here. What we are talking about is cocoa. This is the cornerstone ingredient, and this is basically a processed version of cacao beans. They're usually used a little bit interchangeably, but it is incredibly concentrated in polyphenols, including polyphenols that are linked to better brain function. Flavonoids, which again are a type of polyphenol that can be seen in foods, are linked to improved blood flow to the brain, specifically those flavonoids that are found in dark chocolate. They're linked to improvements in the function of our neurons, and they may actually aid in the formation of new neurons, a process called neurogenesis. There's also a consideration for the caffeine that occurs naturally in dark chocolate as a stimulant. There's a lot to be said about caffeine in general and in terms of who should be consuming it, why they should be consuming it, and how much they should be consuming. But there is pretty clear data showing that caffeine can boost alertness and concentration. I wouldn't say that you should eat dark chocolate for the caffeine, but it is a consideration. And when we look at some of the clinical reviews on what happens when people eat dark chocolate or cocoa, which again is kind of the principal ingredient in dark chocolate, we see that there's evidence for positive effects on cognition and brain oxygenation, in essence saying that there is more to this than simply a little bit of an antioxidant change. There are a number of outcomes that are worthy of our consideration when we consume dark chocolate. So let's talk about a couple of caveats, because before you go out and buy a whole bunch of chocolate and start consuming it in bulk, you probably need to think about this. First thing is, as I just said, natural dark chocolate contains caffeine. So if you're eating a good amount of dark chocolate, you probably don't want to do that immediately before bed, especially if you're super sensitive to caffeine. The second consideration here is the amount of this cacao or cocoa that is in your chocolate. So 20% is certainly not dark chocolate. I shoot for about 85% or higher, and that's the ratio of your cocoa or cacao in your dark chocolate. How much of this is actually that natural chocolate as opposed to all the other things that are added to it that can actually dilute the potential benefit? To that end, you want to check and make sure that your chocolate doesn't have a ton of extra added sugar. That added sugar detracts from the potential health benefits of that chocolate. And in that vein, also look for chocolate that doesn't have a whole lot of extra ingredients or flavorings that can detract from the potential brain health benefits of consuming that dark chocolate. Okay, so we've covered a number of foods, all of which have been studied to have benefits to the brain. Again, I want to emphasize the cornerstone to brain health as we look at diet is diet. It is not an individual food. It is not a specific superfood. But as we've discussed at length in this video, certain foods seem to be better than others, and certain foods have actually been studied for their potential benefits to things like cognition, mood, and general focus. So what I would say with this information is all of us tend to live in this world in which unhealthy foods are the default. Bringing in some of these amazing real foods that we've just discussed in this video is a great way to fight against that, and making them available to you in your home, at your office, wherever you spend the majority of your time, highly incentivizes you to choose them over what would typically be available. So if you make a mix of some blueberries and some nuts and seeds, that's a great way to have a snack available. So you decrease your chances of going over to the vending machine and choosing something which actually has the opposite effect, a negative effect on your brain health. If any of this was interesting to you and you want to learn more about how to optimize your brain using lifestyle tactics and tricks like those we discussed in this video, make sure you're subscribed and check out my other content. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time for some additional content. Talk to you soon.